Welcome to What is Good, a podcast from the Texas Baptist Christian Life Commission, where we explore contemporary cultural issues through a biblical lens. Micah 6:8 says that God has told us what is good, that we're to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with Him. So whether you're seeking a better understanding of how to live that out, or you're just curious to understand a Christian perspective of what's happening in our culture, we hope that you'll find today's conversation helpful as we discuss what is good.
Welcome to another episode of What is Good, the podcast of the Christian Life Commission. Your four hosts are here as always. I'd like to first introduce John Litzler, our Director of Public Policy and also General Counsel for Texas Baptist. Lawyer John Litzler, welcome to the podcast today.
Good morning, David. Thank you. That is the best introduction you've given me so far. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am not a lawyer, David Sanchez, the Director of Ethics and Justice. I'm joined by not a lawyer, Dr. Katie Fruget, who is our intrepid leader, director of the CLC and the Center for Cultural Engagement, and not a lawyer, Irene Gallegos, our director of Hunger and Care.
Now I know how John feels.
I still put doctor to your names, though, for what that's worth.
But not a lawyer. We're not there.
No.
We aspire one day.
Yeah, one day. If you're just tuning in for the first time and wondering what in the world is going on, listen back to our episode on being a light in an election year, and I gave John a slightly less flattering introduction that time.
We care about truth and facts on this podcast. We want to make sure everything is accurate.
Yes.
I want to say that's a super lawyer thing to say. I love it.
All right. Today's topic, we are talking about poverty as it is addressed in the book of Proverbs. We'll be looking at different causes of poverty as they're mentioned in Proverbs, the effects poverty has on people, how Proverbs teaches us that people who are in poverty still have dignity and worth in God's eyes, and finally the call in Proverbs for advocacy for people who are in poverty. But first, did any of you guys ever watch The Price is Right growing up?
I have a friend who was on The Price is Right.
Whoa. Well, somehow that doesn't surprise me, Katie. You always have these really cool stories.
I associate The Price is Right with sick days, because if I was sick and couldn't go to school and stayed home, I flipped on the TV and The Price is Right was always on.
If you remember, getting on to, just making it up to the main stage, you first had to guess on an item, and you had to be the closest without going over. So I want to do something like that. How many times do you think the word poverty or the word poor, let's put them together, is mentioned in the book of Proverbs? In the first 9 chapters, it's the introduction to wisdom personified and why we should pursue wisdom. And the word poor is only mentioned once, but between chapter 10 and chapter 31, give me your bids on how often poor or poverty is mentioned in the book of Proverbs. Closest without going over is the winner.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say you changed the question because you expanded it to poverty and poor. So
yes.
Well,
I didn't want you guys to Google cheat, so I'm throwing in a...
All right, I have to say this, too. There is strategy on The Price is Right to being the third person and getting to just bid one over everyone else. So if you do not pick an order, I'm going to wait and guess last.
Okay.
21. All right, let's go. I was going to say, let's go youngest to oldest.
I love that 21 guess, Irene. I don't know what your logic was, but that is once per chapter, and that's kind of what I had in my mind, too. That's really good.
Yes.
All right, so you're going to go one over or one under that, John?
Oh, I'm not going one under. That's suicide. I'm going 12.
12?
Yeah.
Okay.
A dozen.
Okay. Katie?
I'm going to go with 17.
All right. So Irene wins.
Oh.
Because the word poor is mentioned 35 times in the book of Proverbs. If you just go from 10 to 31, that's basically at least 2 mentions of poverty for every chapter or mention of the poor. So it's actually one of the most talked about topics in the book of Proverbs.
Interesting.
So, Irene, congratulations.
Yay.
Your gift is in the mail, I guess.
For Irene, not a lawyer, not a Bible scholar, a theologian, I'm pretty excited.
So, on a related question, off the top of your head, what do you think are some of the causes of poverty mentioned in Proverbs? If you can think of a verse that goes with it, that's great. If not, I'm ready to go. I've got lots of verses here down to bring up and that we can then discuss. So, Irene, you get to go first.
Oh, great.
What's a cause of poverty you think is mentioned in the book of Proverbs?
This is maybe cynical. The first thing that came to mind was laziness.
Yes. I think for a lot of people, that's the first thing that comes to mind. A little sleep, a little slumber. This one's actually mentioned twice. It's repeated twice in Proverbs. A little folding of the hand, right? And poverty comes on you like a robber. You get the idea. Mm-hmm. One of these, I think, is one of the ones on laziness in Proverbs is actually my life verse. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns in his bed. That's me getting up and hitting snooze. And then hinging back over onto whatever position was most comfortable. But yeah, laziness is mentioned 3 or 4 times as a cause. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Is that not an American verse?
It is. That's
hard
very
working.
Pro-capitalism.
So, all right. So that's one cause. Katie, would you like to go next?
Sure. I was thinking lack of wisdom, like making poor choices or not thinking through things.
Yeah, foolishness is another one that's mentioned. Some of these kind of blend into more than one, but the plans of the diligent lead to abundance. This is Proverbs 21:5. But everyone who is hasty comes to poverty. So when you're rushing for a plan instead of doing it carefully, that could be one type of foolishness, and that can lead to poverty. Also, poverty and disgrace come to him who ignores instruction, but whoever heeds reproof is honored. That's Proverbs 13:18.
Yeah. It made me think of one of our family's mantras is just always wanting to be sure that we're working like smart and hard, because we see so many family members who are really hard workers, but it's not working with wisdom. And so just the productivity is compromised because they're pouring into something, but it's a poor ROI, if you would say that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. John?
I would say gluttony or drunkenness. I don't know if that's two or if they're in one verse. I can't remember the verse, but I feel like maybe they're together.
Like indulgence.
Yeah, indulgence. There we go. Overindulgence.
There you go. Oh, perfect. You guys are doing so great. Not only have you picked 3, you've picked the first 3 on the list.
Hey.
Nice.
Overindulge and in order. This is really creepy. Overindulgence. We hang out too much. Proverbs 13:7. One pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. So the person who's just living it up and overindulging and with their spending. Also, whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich. Proverbs 21:17. So overindulgence is another.
I love that first verse that you said there, David, about pretending to be rich when you're not, because it's just so helpful to remember that appearances are not always reality. And I've driven around in some neighborhoods before where I'm like, wow, this is a really affluent, neighborhood. These people own really nice houses. They own really nice cars. They don't actually own them. They're all financed. And someone had to remind me, this is a neighborhood that is drastically in debt. That's what this neighborhood is,
Yeah. We have an acronym that we use for that called Fit Me. It's fake it till you make it. And we will literally sometimes if we're walking by and see something, we're like, that's Fit Me.
All right. In any order now, do you guys want to try and guess some more? I've got 9 or 10, depending on how they're
I thought of
divided
another one just off the top of my head.
Okay.
Sleeping too much. Like, I don't know how to put that into words, but like the person who's always like I guess it's kind of lazy, but like the person who's just always like choosing sleeping and
idleness.
Slothfulness. That's the word. Slothfulness.
Sloth.
Okay, yeah, I guess we could separate idleness and laziness, and the door hinge one could be more of the just loving sleep, whereas the other one is just not being a hard worker. Yeah, I kind of put those both in laziness, but you can definitely say they're different one. Or lack of initiative.
Yeah.
There you go.
That could be one. I'm working with you here, Katie. Proverbs 14:23. In all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty. So some people, they're not even trying to do anything, but they're talking big. These are my plans. This is what I'm gonna do. And it may not actually be laziness. There's like it just never gets off the ground.
Lack of initiative.
It never gets started.
Don't actually go for it.
Any others you can think of? If not, I'll just keep going through the list and you guys can comment. It's crazy how many there are, right?
I'm really trying to think through.
All right. Scrooginess and disaster are both clumped together in one of the Proverbs. Proverbs 28:22. A stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him.
Talk about not storing up your riches.
So in that, there's both this idea of when you're not generous, sometimes that comes back to bite you in some way. But none of us is in control of the things that happen around us that can impact, all the wealth that we may have stored up. You're born into it, or someone is injured, and that's the cause of it. This one is a little more obscure, but I think it still works. Proverbs 23:10 says, "Do not move an ancient landmark or enter the fields of the fatherless." So this verse is talking about how when if someone becomes an orphan, then the people around them, with the boundaries around them, they easily become someone who can be taken advantage of. And suddenly, you take those rocks that would be the borders between your land and theirs, and you move them a little bit, and you move them a little bit more. And no, now this is my land, this isn't yours. And, you're just a kid, you can't do anything about it. So just being like losing a father or becoming an orphan at a young age.
Yeah, and to expand on that for our modern context, I would say, just what country you're born into. So you were talking about being, family dynamics and all that, but some people are born into really wealthy countries, and some people are born into really impoverished countries. And depending on which country you're born into, it's looking at a global scale of, wealth and poverty.
Yeah. All right, two more. Similar to overindulgence is just flat out addiction. Proverbs 23:20 and 21. Be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags.
That's it. That's the one I was thinking of that references gluttony and drunkardness.
We can all think of people we know, or at least people we know people we know, who after getting addicted to some substance, whether it was alcohol or something heavier, the impact and effects of that not only wrecked them financially, but caused havoc, to the family. And the last one, which, guys, I've got to be honest, we're the Micah 6:8 people. We should be ashamed that we didn't think of oppression as a cause of poverty. Listen, in Proverbs.
Just stop the recording. Close it down.
I was trying to think systems.
There you go. Systems, Irene. Okay, I'll count that. Yes.
I didn't know the verse, but I would.
It will surprise you to know that actually of all the causes, oppression is the one mentioned the most in Proverbs as a cause of poverty. For effect, I want to read several of these to you. Proverbs 13:23. The fallow ground of the poor would yield much fruit, but it is swept away through injustice. 30:14. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from the earth, the needy from among mankind. Proverbs 22:16. Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty. And 22:22. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate.
I think some of those even tie into what John was mentioning as far as from that global perspective, what country you're going to, and even how oppression, whether that's by a society, by political systems, there's different types of different layers of oppression that are enforced.
Irene, we were talking about this when we were visiting the border, and you were sharing with us, and so were some of the people at the border, that even just trying to get across the border, whether legally or illegally, there are cartels that are charging you fees.
Oh, yes.
Just to let you pass through their territory so you can have a shot to try and get across.
Yep. There's no guarantee.
There's systems all around, and it's not always just governmental systems, but there are places where oppression is just running wild. But I even think just when I hear about things like the way truckers are treated, like the way the financing for truckers is that they're paid by the mile and not by the hour, and so they're losing money when they're sitting at stations waiting to get their product, or how they're told to drive through the night. There's just so many. You can almost pick your industry and find this at work.
It's absolutely true. I particularly think of workers when you're talking about employees and stuff. Workers who fall in the cracks that aren't covered by some of the federal protections for workers, for minimum wage and things like that. Seasonal workers, people who work in fields picking tomatoes and things like that, who don't fall under those protections, and the injustice in those situations keeping people in poverty.
Yep.
And I think if you expand it out to the global conversation, I want to say it's N.T. Wright, who's a fairly famous theologian in England, said that one of the greatest things that the Western church needs to address is the injustice of third world debt, and how first world countries have exploited these third world countries and incurred an amount of debt that they'll never be able to repay. I mean, it's generations and generations worth of debt, and the importance of recognizing that.
So exploitation not just happening at a personal level or a business level, but between countries. That is something I'd never even thought of. Something new to be depressed about. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's good.
What is bad?
That's kind of what we're talking about in a way, is all these. But we'll get to what is good within Proverbs as well. So growing up in your circles, like, which causes were the most commonly mentioned from Proverbs, and why do you think that is?
Definitely not oppression or injustice. I think it tended to be the causes like laziness that could be attributed to a person's character. So nothing that was beyond your control, like a global pandemic or an economic collapse that you didn't really have anything to do with, but everything that was attributable to your character. I'm doing well and you are not because I have made better choices and you have chosen to either be lazy or slothful or overindulge. And if you had made better choices like me, then you would not be in poverty. That was kind of the general bent. Not in my household. I want to be very clear that is not what I was taught by my parents. But I think that was a message in my community growing up.
John, the lawyer, with a disclaimer. I'm not surprised. Katie, go ahead.
Well, I agree with John, but I almost would give like a double-sided answer that was definitely kind of the zeitgeist of like the community I was in. Like that was the messaging that they were giving. But now that I look back on it, I vividly remember people having multiple jobs, just working, I don't even know how many, 80 plus hours a week just to kind of put groceries and food on the table. Mm-hmm. So what I would have probably identified as laziness as a, young adult, I look now and say, no, this is a systemic oppression, that there are, you shouldn't have to work, if you're working 80, 90 hours a week, just to put groceries on the table, there's a systemic issue at root there.
Yeah, I would say in my household there's a little blending, and so I think I know I have one parent who, when this parent migrated to the U.S., experienced heavy racism, and so I think there was that discussion of oppression in our household, and then at the same time, because of migration coming, that American dream desire, where we continue to work hard, and because we work hard, we're going to have great outcomes. And so I think there was also that discussion on, because of our hard work, we will overcome the oppression.
Yeah. For me, it was always only laziness. I only ever heard the little sleep, little slumber, little folding of the hands. It was always, if you're poor, it's your own fault. Never any of these other causes. So I remember, like, the first time I just read through Proverbs and looked at every mention of poor and poverty, or other verses that were tangentially related, it just opened my eyes. I was like, wow, I need to work on how I look at this and how I look at people who I would classify as poor. So speaking of that, when we hear people argue over policies related to helping those who are at the poverty level here in the States, do you think that they're considering all the causes of poverty, or are they more focused on particular ones?
It depends which people.
I think, honestly, Irene, speak to that, because I think you're spot on.
Yes. I mean, you look at the different households that we, or the environments, even not just our specific households that we just mentioned, but just the environments that we were in. And so I think that depending on the upbringing and the political climate even, and the discussions around the causes of poverty have a large contribution to that perspective. And not just poverty in general, but overall capitalism, socialism type conversations. What was the context of the environment, and it heavily leans on what is the kind of political climate in that region.
I think that's right. Where you stand is based on where you sit. And so your perspective and your position is going to influence this greatly. And one of the things that we have to challenge ourselves to do is think outside of our immediate situation and our background and upbringing, and think about others in circumstances that are different from us. I work with a group of advocates at the Capitol that I think do a pretty good job of trying, when they approach policy, try to think of all of the different causes of poverty. There may be some blind spots there, but for the most part, it's diverse enough of a group that cares about fighting poverty, whatever the cause or source may be, that we tend to get a pretty good perspective from someone in the group. And when I say group, we're part of a coalition called the Texas Fair Lending Alliance, and that's kind of what I'm referring to. But there are lots of groups at the Capitol who are working on this issue. So, yeah, I think one thing that you can do is be in conversation with people who have experienced poverty or who work with people in poverty, and they will help you intentionally or unintentionally find your blind spots of areas where you may be missing some of the causes of poverty.
And just to add to that too, John, I think it's also important within certain circles to like destigmatize just being honest about being broke. There's such a push to have that fake it till you make it, appear to have all of your life together. And so we really stigmatize, or like we're not incentivized at the least to want to be honest. Like if we're living hand to mouth or something like that, if we're really struggling, there can be stigma related to that. One of the things that is interesting to me is just how just telling my own lived experience as being, married and being a broke student and being honest about how broke we were really helps break down some of those stereotypes that you think of when you think things like lazy, poverty, welfare systems, stuff like that. I've been on SNAP, I've been on WIC, I've been on food stamps, like I've been on all of those programs on Medicaid, and I don't normally fit the bill of what people think of when they immediately stereotype programs like that that are really intended for people living in poverty. But realistically, there was a significant portion of our lives where we were just broke and we needed a lot of help. And it was not very comfortable at the time to talk about that and be honest about it, just because of the pressure to appear to have it all the time.
And if I could add that even in some circles, I think it's also which circle. So let's say I'm in the circle where I'm closer to the need, in the sense of, let's say I'm the one who needs the assistance. I may not be considering the policies. And so what I'm going to is there's also that cultural and even religious lens, where the church, I may not even see the government resource as a solution. I see the church as a solution. I see that I'm going to go to my neighbors. I'm going to go to family. I'm going to use my community, and including the church for that solution. And so if I'm on the receiving end and I hear people talking about policies about the poor that honestly might be even foreign to me, because I'm not used to relying on a government resource, I'm used to relying on community. I'm used to, whether that's family, church family, different dynamics there.
Irene, I think that is so great, because I want to take an opportunity to say I think churches are still doing a really great job of this. Our Texas Baptist churches that I work with in particular, I know are, but not just that, Catholic Charities, I think we mentioned earlier, other organizations and other groups are. And just real quickly, some of our churches first became involved in advocating for policies regulating payday lending because they have benevolence programs, and a lot of our churches do, where anyone from the community can come in and say, I need help. And churches are known for that. And people tell them, sorry, we can't do anything but go to First Baptist Church down the street or whatever church down the street. And they know that they have budgeted to have money to help people who need it. And to their credit, churches don't say, well, which is your cause of poverty? And if it's this cause, we're not going to help you with grocery money or utility bill money. But what they do is they do talk to them and they find out their stories and they learn causes of poverty when they do that. And a lot of our pastors have gotten involved because through a program like that, they have learned here is an injustice in our community, or here is, it's not always injustice, here's an addiction in our community, here is whatever cause of poverty they learn. But to do that, you have to be engaged and you have to be willing to help to learn what those causes of poverty are. So I think that's really good.
David, if you'll allow me to take one more step further.
Go right ahead.
Just because I'm so, when I recently connected with a church in Stephenville who, exactly to your point, and not only it is so beautiful to me is not only one church having a benevolence program, but what this church did in Stephenville is they said, you know what, we're going to collaborate with multiple churches. And so when someone comes to them, and really it was because one single church did not have the means to have this large benevolence fund. And so what multiple Baptist churches, and I think even other denominations, but particularly a group of Baptist churches in the area, not just in Stephenville, but in surrounding cities, said is when someone comes to us, here we have this list of churches who have committed to be part of this network, if you will. And each church, when someone comes to them, will pledge $10 each, $20 each. And so by the time you go to multiple churches, you have, and it takes a phone call, and they know that the phone call is going to lead to a yes. It's a matter of just, hey, this month we can only do $5, or this month we can do 20, and adding those few churches up fits the bill and pays the bill. And so I thought that was just beautiful, a beautiful example of collaboration in the broader sense, not just at one single church, but multiple churches collaborating together.
I love how this conversation is just kind of showing also like the different things that the CLC is involved in at the same time. And I'm thinking, I can't wait for John Litzler to do a podcast related specifically to payday lending and how that is oppression of the poor and how that leads to greater debt. I can't wait till we hear Irene's next podcast on all the different ways that the Texas Baptist Hunger Offering is helping. So let's hurry up and finish this podcast so we can get to these other ones.
So listen to this one first and then go listen to the next one after that.
So yeah, now I want to just look at talking about some of the effects of poverty, but we may get into this more with Irene's discussion as well. These are listed in Proverbs, and I would just like your thoughts on each of them as I read them out. So one is just the insecurity that comes from being in poverty. Proverbs 10:15 says, "A rich man's wealth is his strong city. The poverty of the poor is their ruin." And for some reason, this just makes me think of like Jericho before and after the walls fell. And what that city, what it must have felt like to live in a city with strong walls like that. And just so many walls of protection that we who can afford them have with our house insurance and our car insurance and our health insurance. It's like even when catastrophes happen, it would have to be really bad to completely knock us off our feet at this point. We feel so safe and so secure because of where we're at. But then you think of someone in poverty, and this is a city with its walls down.
Absolutely. It made me think of, I had two examples that just immediately popped in my head when you were talking, David. First one was a friend of ours that we were trying to help him get a job and knew somebody who was hiring. And long story short, our friend wouldn't give this guy a job because he didn't have reliable transportation. So this guy was just one car start away from having a meaningful job that could really help him provide for his family. And just because his car couldn't reliably start and get him back and forth to this location, he didn't have the opportunity to have that job, which is just heartbreaking. But that's the reality of so many people. Just even the lack of access of reliable transportation or something like that is going to prevent them from being able to have that next level. And then the second example I thought of was the children in Texas. When COVID-19 shut the schools down, you had thousands of children in Texas who were relying on school meals for breakfast and lunch, and several of them were being sent home a bag for dinner, who weren't, at that moment, they weren't hungry, but the moment schools shut down and they didn't have access to that, they were food insecure, and that they were suddenly put into that hunger, actually dealing with hunger-related issues. So it's not that it's even you're living in crisis, but you're one thing away from that crisis becoming catastrophic.
I think that's the key thing that you said, Kitty. Like one accident away or one incident away, where when I think of insecurity, I think of snowball effects. Well, if this one little domino happens, then it knocks down the next domino, which knocks down the next domino, and then that means my car won't start, and then I'll lose the job. And if I lose the job, then I can't pay my rent. And then if I can't pay my rent, then I'm out of my house. And that's what leads to something like homelessness, for example, which is an example of poverty. It doesn't just start with going, well, I'm going to buy too big of a house that I can't afford, and I'm just going to be out of here in a couple of months, or I'm just going to refuse to pay my rent, or I'm just going to quit my job tomorrow. It's usually something very small that starts a domino effect.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another effect of poverty on those in it is isolation. Proverbs 19:4, wealth brings many new friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friend. And Proverbs 19:7, all a poor man's brothers hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? He pursues them with words, and they are not there.
I think this connects well to Katie's point earlier about destigmatizing poverty, right? It can be isolating, especially if we don't talk about it. And if we have to pretend like we have our act together, or if we have to fake it till we make it, we don't think people want to hear about our financial struggles. It seems like everyone else is doing fine, so why am I struggling financially? I think all of those things isolate you. And I particularly think isolation plays in strongly to one of the causes that you mentioned, David, which is addiction. If the source of your poverty is some kind of addiction, whether that be addiction to a chemical substance or a gambling addiction or something like that, that's even more isolating and can be even more isolating and make it very difficult to share with others or be frank about kind of that root cause of what's causing your financial insecurity.
And the last one for insecurity, Katie mentioned school children, and oftentimes I feel like with school children, they may not know that the person right next to them is hungry, because that's something internal. But when I think of isolation, and I think of kids in, the typical, what are they wearing? And that comparison, and really when that verse, that wealth brings many new friends, I think of when you're in school and you want the nicer things, you want to wear what others are wearing, and really it translates into adults. Someone recently commented on my Kendra Scott earrings, and what's funny to me is that the two pairs that I have are not even personal purchases; they were gifts. And so, but just how often we, again, and I'm gonna learn the fake it till you make it. I forgot what you called it, the acronym, but fit me. But yes, that perception, because oftentimes we look at what others are wearing or the titles that they have, and that comparison, I think is one of the things that easily, our perception of what others look or what others have can easily lead to isolation.
Yeah, I remember seeing the effects of it in a very simple but heartbreaking way, where a homeless man came up to me and just asked if he could borrow my phone to call somebody. And he called someone and they didn't pick up. And so he asked, well, can I use it again? And I said, sure. And he called another person and they didn't pick it up. And he said, can I use it again? And I'm like, absolutely. And he called another person and they didn't pick up. So here was, now granted, it wasn't a number they might have recognized, but nevertheless, here's someone just trying to reach out to anybody and is already in a position where people were less eager to be of help or to answer. And that kind of leads to another effect of poverty, and we've talked about this a lot already, but just vulnerability. Proverbs 22:7, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender.
Yeah, I think of when I was getting ready for this podcast, I just even looked up some national statistics, and it kind of aligns exactly what you're talking about, just this oppression issue. I was unaware of this, but apparently 1/3 of U.S. households in a 2022 study found people living, 1/3 of households living at the poverty line. That's a pretty high number. Texas is above the U.S. average. It's 12.6% in the U.S. It's 14% in Texas. So in Texas, that equals almost 4 million. It's like 3.9 million people in Texas living in poverty. And I don't see how that can't be a systemic issue, like that there's some oppressive systemic issues that we need to be honest about if we're going to be able to have a meaningful change on.
When I went to South Texas for different roles, and one of the events happening at that time was a Women's Missionary Union, WMU, home build, and in partner,
shout out WMU,
yes,
love the youth,
and
yes,
collaboration with Buckner. And I thought when they mentioned, okay, we're going to go visit a colonia, I thought, okay, I was thinking over 10 years ago, the first time I saw a colonia was, flat land, dirt, and a shack with no running water, no electricity. They were like running the electricity from miles away with a line that was not safe. And this seemed like a somewhat developed area. And what I later learned was that because of Buckner's involvement, and even WMU has been doing more home builds, they have really helped develop a certain community. And what was fascinating to me is though the way that they, through the Family Hope Centers and help teaching individuals, there's a level of investment that these individuals give in order to receive from the home build. But what was fascinating to me is that some of the surrounding communities, the interest rates that they were sharing, that they they may own this, or they may have this new built home, but yet this plot of land that they're still trying to pay off is at a 17% interest rate. And so it's just shocking to me, that level of oppression. And again, that systemic issue that, okay, we're trying to address multiple things, and how empowering to have a home that's yours that you don't owe on, yet sit on a land that you're still paying these ridiculous interest rates on. There's just more work to be done.
I want to share just a word of encouragement in this area. This verse strikes me very strongly that the borrower is the slave of the lender. And man, we have such an unhealthy relationship in our country with debt and maxing out credit cards and all that kind of stuff. And I think about that strong language, the borrower being the slave of the lender. And I do want to point out that we've made some great progress, at least in American society, in this area. Not that there's not a lot more work to do, but we don't have debtor's prison. You don't go to jail for failure to pay your debts. We don't have indentured servitude anymore. You do not have to go work for someone until you can pay off your debt. There are examples of both of those things in Scripture and in the Bible. And that's not part of our culture anymore. And not only that, we have bankruptcy, and we believe in second chances, and you can wipe out your debt, and a lot of your debt, and no longer be a slave to a poor financial decision you've made or what you've borrowed. So there is hope and there is progress, and we are a country still that believes in second chances and not going to jail or being made a slave or a servant just because of poor financial decisions or bad luck or even laziness or addiction. There are opportunities, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about advocacy later, but there's still room for progress, but man, we've come a long way.
100%. I'm so glad you said that, John, because even when I was getting ready for this, all those numbers I was citing earlier, they're better. It's improving. Like, we have seen marked improvement over the last decade. So like we are on a good track. It doesn't mean we can't go a lot better. We can't keep improving, but there's a lot of improvement that we've even seen in the last decade since they've started measuring some of these things.
Thank you guys for that. This is the What is Good podcast.
That's right.
So we can always count on John to point out the positives. Thank you for that. Speaking of positives, here's 2 positives for being in poverty, if you can believe it. The first one is humility. Proverbs 18:23. The poor uses entreaties, but the rich answer roughly.
I'm glad we've gotten to some of the positives. And when I saw humility on this list, I was like, oh, that's a good thing. And there are positives, and there are other proverbs in Scripture. I can't remember the exact reference, but I know there's one that says that it's better to be poor or in poverty and keep your integrity and do what's right than it is to be rich off of basically ill-gotten gains and do what's not right. And so, I would not describe poverty as a good thing, but it is not the ultimate good. And sometimes in our capitalist society, it can be get rich, whatever the means. The ends are justified as long as you come out ahead in the game and make more money. And that's how you become the exploiter, and that's how you become the oppressor and take advantage of more financial. I mean, you become part of the problem, and you're like, well, I'm not in poverty. Yeah, that's because you're impoverishing others by your actions. And so, it's much better to be in poverty or to be poor or to be struggling and to be a follower of Christ and to do what's right and to keep your Christian witness. And Christ tells us to be humble. And absolutely struggling paycheck to paycheck, not knowing where your money for rent is going to come from that month is humbling. Having to ask people for help, having to borrow money from friends is humbling. And I'm not saying that we should all want to struggle financially, but situations like Katie has shared, I've been on WIC before and didn't think I was going to be, and it had to do with us fostering. And I thought, here I am, I'm this attorney, I've got this decent job, I'm never going to need any government program. And here we are on WIC. And having to go through that and stand in the checkout line at the grocery store is humbling. And there is character growth and development that comes from that. And there are positive things that come from the recognition that whatever you have, however wealthy you are, it could disappear tomorrow in another housing crash, in a stock market crash. That these things are not yours, they're God's ultimately. And so, I do think there is a lot of positive that can come from understanding what it's like to struggle financially, and humility is absolutely one of those things.
In true gospel kind of format, it seems to me that also there's a component here in this conversation where we need to acknowledge that sometimes poverty doesn't mean lack of money. Like, you can be wealthy and be morally impoverished. You can have there's some flipping or inverse of priorities or things that it's important, that it would be better to have no money but be rich in morals, to be rich in community. David, I feel like Scripture also kind of highlights that sometimes those who have the most money are still, like, they still use words like poor or impoverished, right?
Yeah. I'm thinking directly of the rich young ruler, though, right now, and just like he's actually in more trouble spiritually for how well off he thinks he is and how morally right he thinks he is, and even just the Beatitudes where Jesus says, in Matthew he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." In Luke he just says, "Blessed are the poor."
Yeah,
like that there are some blessings that come with not having a ton. One of those is, oddly enough, even though there's insecurity and isolation and vulnerability, not having a ton also means having less to worry about. Proverbs 13:8, "The ransom of a man's life is his wealth, but a poor man hears no threat."
I just think of, like, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Like, if your treasure is in your wealth and everything, that's just... Like John has said, the housing market could crash. You could see the stock market crash, and then suddenly you've got all these worries that go along with that because that's where your treasure was.
I'm going to totally butcher the name here, but there's an artist, India Ari, and there's a song there that's called "There's Hope." And
can you sing it for us?
You would not want me to. I can send you the song and you can play it on the uke later.
Okay. Show notes.
In the show notes.
It'll be in the show notes.
And the song really talks about how she went to Brazil and she met a young man, and she said she was from the USA, and this man was blind, and she basically the result was they realized that she was more poor than he was, and not financially, but in her perception. And so, and I've thought that before. I don't, and even when in considering the Texas Baptist Hunger Offering, in all reality, I don't know what it's like to be hungry, to not know where my next meal is coming from in that sense of hunger. But I have hungered for other areas of life where I'm lacking and I'm poor. And so it takes a different spin on it.
I think of people who win the lottery and how they can come into this vast sum of money and then quickly become poor again because it's either spent unwisely or because other people want it. And they get taken advantage of. And I think of professional athletes who may come from a poorer neighborhood. I've heard stories, they come from a poor neighborhood, they get these millions of dollars in their first contract, and they feel like they need to take care of friends and family. And next thing you know, they've gone broke despite having this immense wealth. And just all of the worry that comes from, wealth in those situations and how money it's not the solution to everything. Their phrases, can't buy happiness, more money, more problems. I think that's true to an extent. I do think that it does bring an amount of worry, particularly if you spend a lot of time focusing on that. If you make it the focus of all that you do, if every action you take in life is to either make more money or to raise kids in a way where they can make more money, I do think it creates a lot of worry. I mean, little things that you wouldn't think are directly related to money. So why am I so worried about this particular thing? Because I'm worried about how it will affect my kid's grade. Well, why am I so worried about my kid's grade? Because I want them to graduate and get into a good college. Well, why? Because I want them to become a well-rounded person? No, because I want them to get a really good high-paying job where they don't have to worry about money, right? So I'm blowing up this small thing into a huge thing, ultimately because I just want my child to be a high-income earner that I don't have to worry about.
Yeah, and that maybe can support you in your old age.
Yes,
right?
and take care of me because I'm going to need it. And you don't realize you're worrying about all those things when you blow up over this incident at your kid's school or whatever. But you are carrying that worry. That it's way down the line, and it may not be articulated. But that's part of why you're flipping out over your child getting a B on the test instead of an A or whatever the situation is.
That's so good, John. If I could go back a little to Irene's, where she was saying that the singer was singing a song about how the blind person was in some ways more rich than she was. Another thing that Proverbs points out about poverty is that exact truth, that there's more to life and there are more types of riches than just monetary wealth. There's righteousness, and the poor can be just as righteous in God's eyes as the rich. Proverbs 15, 16, and 17 really kind of hit on this, where it's like, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. And better is the dinner of herbs where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it. Like, if you have the choice between the two, it's better to have less, but fear God and love others. For that second one, better is the dinner with herbs than where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it. I like to say better is salad with a love ballad than a steak with hate.
Classic.
But that also points out something else about Proverbs, which is it gives dignity to the poor. It's so clear from Proverbs that they're trying to say, these people, there are so many reasons why you may come to poverty, and some of them may be on you and some of them may not. But again, there's no qualification for whether or not a poor person, whatever their cause was, is of value in God's eyes. Proverbs 22:2, the rich and the poor meet together, the Lord is the maker of them all. And 29:13, the poor man and the oppressor meet together, the Lord gives light to the eyes of both.
I think that's so beautiful, and I because of a recent conference, think of even when we consider those who give in the church. There are some who give high dollar amounts, and there are some who give lower dollar amounts. And oftentimes, those who are not maybe contributing as much financially may be contributing in other ways. It doesn't, when I think of the righteousness of the two, it's not one is more righteous than the other because of their monetary, their gift in their tithe and offerings, but we can also just value the way that people give of their talent and their time as well. So side thought, but that's what I thought of when I heard, because yes, at the end of the day, they're both giving to the Lord, and the Lord is seeing them the same.
Irene, as you're saying that, it just reminds me, I know we're on a podcast, but just for people who are trying to visualize what's going on, we're all in different locations right now, and I'm in my office. And if I just scooted my computer over a little bit, you would see I've got a little gift that somebody gave me. I was on a mission trip once, and I'll never forget it. We were in Costa Rica, and it was supposed to be a mission trip for us to be able to pour into this community. And, you know, we were doing a VBS or something like that, but in just kind of a true gospel type twist of the events, that was probably one of the most impactful and meaningful mission trips I've ever been on, because of the ministry that they gave to us and the way that they poured into us and showed us the image of God and just the way that God works in all sorts of different people in meaningful ways. I remember sitting there, we were in a tiny little hut. I mean, it was like my office is bigger than this person's house was. And he was beaming because he had 10 believers gathered in his home, and he had the privilege of hosting the communion of saints. And I mean, he almost had tears in his eyes just from the pride and the honor of doing that. And the tears in our eyes as these Westerners who thought we were going to come in here and pour into him and watching him pour into us. It was life-changing. It was life-changing for all of us. And I don't know where he is now. Maybe he's with God. Maybe he's still serving his community. But I will never forget him and the impact that he's had on the trajectory of my life, and how enriching of a moment that was for us.
So good.
I love that. I've attended Beautiful Feet a few times. I don't know if any, Katie, if you've ever gone. It's the ministry to the homeless in like inner city of Fort Worth.
Oh, yeah.
And I always appreciate when there's a message to those people there that's you are still, not just you are still of value to God, but even in the situation you're in, you can have an impact for God's kingdom. Anyone in any situation can be used by God. And guess what? He tends to use the people who it would surprise us the most.
Yeah.
That's kind of God's MO. It kind of has always been. David over Goliath, choosing Jacob over Esau. It's always been his MO. And so good for them. And maybe we should do what we can to help them, but not look with the pity eyes of the person who is better than them, because we're not. Also, along those lines, we need to remember God not only loves them as much, there's also some proverbs saying that God is looking out for them. And if not immediately, in the midst of all this oppression, someday there will be a judgment for the oppressors if they do not if they do not plead the blood of Christ. Proverbs, let's see, I've got like 7 here. I'm just going to try and cherry pick a couple of them. I got 7 different verses on God is watching on how the poor are treated and will judge accordingly. Proverbs 21:13, whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered. Proverbs 22:22 and 23, do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted in court. For the Lord will please their cause, and rob of life those who rob them. Go God, right? That's serious. That's serious stuff. Okay, and then a good one. Proverbs 19:17, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord. Anybody hearing Matthew 25 in there? And he will repay him for his deeds. I just love that along with Proverbs giving dignity to the poor, it also reminds us that God's looking out for them and challenging us, not just with our attitudes, but with our actions towards them. Speaking of actions towards them, there are several Proverbs as well that also challenge us to be advocates for the poor. One of my favorites is Proverbs 31:8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And yes, Proverbs 31 is where the Proverbs 31 woman is, but that's before that part starts. So that applies to all of us, not just the women. But guess what? The Proverbs 31 woman cares about the poor and the oppressed as well. It says she opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. In Proverbs 29:7, a righteous man knows the rights of the poor, like a lawyer. That's not in there, John Litzler, but just another shout out to you. And a wicked man does not understand such knowledge. So, John, with all these verses in Proverbs, not just about the causes of poverty and how we should have a better understanding of that, but also about advocacy for those who are being taken advantage of because we're in a position where we can. What do we do with this? What can we do with this?
Yeah, now you're talking my language. Now these are verses that I love. I'm so glad that you took the time to read through each one of those. One of the things I would say is we are all advocates at some level, and we can all talk to people who are in a position of authority or power or that have the ability to make change in whatever circle that may be. It may be as simple as talking to the principal at your school, or your school board, or someone at your city council to make change locally. It can be writing and calling your congressman or your senator at the federal level. It could be something that affects the entire nation, but it doesn't have to be. And there are all different ways that we can advocate and that we can get involved to advocate for those who we see who are suffering from impoverished conditions as a result of whatever the issue may be. And, some of the ones that the CLC advocates for that I can think of are, we've already mentioned payday lending. Also related to poverty caused by addiction, we advocate against the expansion of gambling in Texas. And we've already done a whole podcast episode specifically talking about efforts to expand gambling in Texas. But one of the things I love about the way the CLC addresses this issue, at least at a state level, is that we have categorized this public policy priority as preventing predatory financial practices, which is broad, but it covers all types of predatory financial practices that would hold people in poverty, and that would be unjust or oppressive in the way that we do finance. And so that's one way that we're doing it. But man, you can advocate against, I'll tell you one. I'll tell you a simple one. We've got a program at our school where you put money on like an electronic card or balance for your kid at school. On its face, it's pretty neutral. It's an easy way to do it where the school gets the money for school lunches. You don't lose it. It's easy to do, but you have to do it through this program. They use this particular program, and this program charges an exorbitant fee. It's not even like a credit card standard, like couple percent fee. It is like 15%. Now,
wow.
What?
Yeah, it's well, let me take it back. That's not 15%. It's not a percent. It's a dollar amount. I think it might be $5 per transfer. So if you are wealthy enough that you can put several $100s on your kid's school lunch program at the beginning of the year, you may pay $5, and that's a relatively low percent. But if you are living paycheck to paycheck, and every Monday you have to put money onto your kid's balance for their school lunches for the week, then you're paying $5 a week, not $5 a semester. And that adds up. Next thing you're spending $100 a semester more than. And so advocating can be as simple as going to your school and saying, hey, I understand we use this program for convenience or whatever, but do you realize how difficult this is for people who may be on the borderline of qualifying for free lunch and not quite qualifying, but here they are paying this $5 fee every time they need to get another paycheck and need to put more money on the card. So that's just one example. But if you pay attention and you talk to people in your community and you keep your eyes open to these things, there are always opportunities to advocate for changes to help the poor.
Check. Everything he just said.
Katie just made a big check mark motion with her hand, like on a whiteboard, or maybe even a chalkboard. I was getting A+++ vibes from that one.
That was the aesthetic I was going for.
I knew John was going to bring it home. That's why I put the last question towards him, and now everyone's just trying to get emojis to respond. Now
I appreciate it. That's amazing.
Camera.
It is like Zoom.
No, my screen is bugging out. Thanks for bringing it home, John. And we like to end our podcast by focusing on the good we see happening around us. So I would like to end today by asking you guys, what is good?
I'll share a very personal one is what is good is my husband staying home with the kids while I am out on a work travel. And so I am very appreciative. We have an almost 1-year-old and almost 4-year-old. Wow. Yes. At the end of the summer, we'll have a 1-year-old and 4-year-old, 2 boys. And hilarious, the almost 4-year-old recently discovered that he wants to try wrestling his baby brother, and I don't, we're trying to explain to him we're not quite at that stage yet, and I'll have to
Get ready.
yes. But nonetheless, my husband.
Speaking of oppression,
I'm so proud of him. My mom is helping out, and so I'm so thankful for family support altogether, but in particular, just my husband and just the great support that he is so that this ministry can be carried out.
that's really cool.
So mine is good, but it could also be terrifying. But I think it's still going to be a what is good thing. I recently heard on the news of this crazy story of an orangutan who was injured. He injured his eye, and scientists just kind of sat back and watched. The orangutan selected a plant that was known in that region to have medicinal properties, chewed it up, and self-healed himself, created a bandage and put it on. The wound healed, it cleaned it out, it did not get infected. This was a life-ending type of injury initially. This orangutan, they don't know if it was a learned behavior, if he was taught it by others. It's wild. It could be Planet of the Apes, so maybe it's a little scary.
What?
But I thought it was the coolest thing that God has created these animals that have the ability to, through I don't even know how, was able to learn how to put its own medicine on. It didn't eat the plant. He literally chewed it, stuck it out of his mouth, and put it on his eye to heal. It was the coolest story I'd heard in a long time. So there you go.
They didn't name him Caesar, did they?
No, they did not.
Okay, good.
That's amazing. I'm going to have to Google this story when we're done with this podcast.
Wow. How about you, John?
My what is good is the Gallegos family. So you're going to have to let me set it up for a second. So we have a community library in Dripping Springs, and I've never lived in a community that had a community library like this. It is not a public library that is funded by our tax dollars or folks in the community. It was in 1985. Dripping Springs, where I live, was an incredibly small community then. It's still not large now, but it was just people donating books and that kind of thing. And our community has exploded. There are tons of people moving to this area, and they have way more library cards than, I think 5 times more than what they can account for. They have no space for books. They have no space for people, and they need a new building. And so they did a fundraiser, and I just shared it on my social media because I've got a lot of people at our church that I know would want to support it, and I've made friends in the community and friends with parents of other kids in Viv's school. And I just shared it out there, and the Gallegos donated to our community library.
Aww.
In a community where they have no other connections other than the fact that Irene has a coworker that's here and a family they care about with a kid who's in a stage in life right now where she's learning to read, and with just the kindest comment that said, hey, we know a kid in that community that's learning to read and we want to support this. And it was just a beautiful thing, and I was really touched by it, and I'm so grateful. And our library met its goal. I think they're going to start construction on a new building soon, and I'm just really excited for Drip.
Aw, I love that.
Thank you. Shout out to Viv.
David,
That's really cool.
what is good for you?
All right, so the one that just came to mind, I've had unique care provided to me by our various healthcare systems these last couple weeks. Had my first colonoscopy last week. That came back clear, so praise God, I don't need another one for 10 years. 2 days ago, I had a root canal, and last night, a church member pointed out to me, David, you are being worked literally top to bottom. So, thank you, God, for caring for me from my top throughout. That's probably the best joke I've heard all year, and even though it's at my expense, I'm okay with it. We can leave that in, right?
I don't see why not.
Katie nodded yes, but she's also doubled over, so I can't tell if that was really a nod or not. But that's what is good.
Wow.
Props to that church member. That's like a grade A joke right there.
It really, I was like, wow. It's been staring me in the face for several days, and I had no idea. So props to them. Anyways, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. Not sure how to end from there. The music should be cued in. There it is. I've been David Sanchez.
Katie Fruge.
Irene Gallegos.
Attorney John Litzler.
Yeah. Seriously though, like joke of the year.
My eye is watering from laughing.
My cheeks are hurting from laughing.
Irene, congratulations!
Yay.
Your gift is in the mail, I guess.
I feel like
I'll give you another.
For Irene, not a lawyer, not a Bible scholar, a theologian, I'm pretty excited.
I'll give you another Paylocity badge for
Wonderful.
for best prices right guesser. All right, so yes.
Wait, can I explain that real quickly?
Sure.
Okay, so we have this like internal software that we use at the BGCT for a lot of different things related to employment stuff. And David has discovered that you can give someone a badge for anything.
Yes.
He can create it and send it to you. And so
It's
you
so
can get a
fun.
badge for sharing your lunch with someone in the workroom. You can get a badge for showing up to a meeting 5 minutes early. You can literally get a badge for anything David can create. So
I did give someone
Irene,
a badge. I did give someone a badge for being at dinner with me one night and my family, and they were doing a good job of dice rolling during a game that we were playing, and I gave them a badge for best dice roller at dinner.
I was going to say, as much as people love getting badges, I don't think anyone has more joy than David giving the badges.
That is true. That is true.
It's more blessed to give badges than receive.
I think we need to have another episode on gambling if David's going to be talking about dice rolling
I thought
in the middle of the podcast. We might need to revisit that topic again.
The game is King of Tokyo. You're just trying to be the monster that gets to 20 points or kills the other monsters first.
It wasn't during the
So
family
we've got
worship
gambling and we've got killing people and
Murder.
it's turning into monsters.
Monsters.
Our director
Monsters not made in God's image.
our director of ethics and justice, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. And that will all now be in the outtakes. All right.